Everyone in the neighborhood called her Grandma Ruth, even those who weren't related to her. She had earned that name long before her hair turned white, long before her hands began to tremble when winter came. She was the kind of woman who showed up when no one else did, who fed children that weren't hers and listened without interrupting. That's why no one questioned it when she raised a little boy alone. People assumed life had been unfair to her, as it often was to women like Ruth, and they admired her strength without ever asking what it had cost her. The boy's name was Daniel. At least, that's what Ruth told everyone. She brought him home one rainy evening wrapped in a thin blanket, his face red from crying, his tiny fingers clutching the edge of her coat. She told the neighbors his parents had died in an accident. The story was simple, tragic, and believable enough that no one asked for details. In a town where people preferred peace over truth, silence was accepted as kindness. Ruth raised Daniel as if he were her own flesh and blood. She packed his lunches, sat through school meetings, and worked extra hours to keep the lights on. She never missed a birthday, though she never celebrated her own. When Daniel asked questions about his parents, Ruth answered carefully, always with love, never with specifics. She said they had loved him very much, that they would have been proud, and that sometimes life took people before they were ready to go. What Daniel didn't know was that Ruth kept a small box hidden in the back of her closet, behind old coats and forgotten shoes. Inside were documents she never looked at unless she was alone, and sure no one was watching. Papers that proved Daniel was never meant to be hers. Papers that tied him to a past she had buried so deeply she sometimes convinced herself it wasn't real. As Daniel grew older, people began to comment on how little he resembled Ruth. Their skin tones didn't match. Neither did their eyes. Ruth laughed it off every time, saying he took after his father. When pressed, she changed the subject. Humor became her shield. Silence her armor. There were nights Ruth sat at the kitchen table long after Daniel had gone to bed, staring at the door as if expecting someone to walk through it. She never cried loudly. She cried the way people do when they've learned not to be heard. Quietly, carefully, as if tears themselves were a luxury she couldn't afford. Daniel grew into a kind man, responsible, grateful. He loved Ruth deeply and never doubted that she was his mother in every way that mattered. When she fell sick one winter and spent weeks in bed, he took care of her without complaint, cooking meals and holding her hand when the pain became too much. It was during one of those nights that Ruth almost told him the truth. The words rested heavy on her chest, pressing against her ribs, begging to be released. But when Daniel smiled at her and called her mom, she swallowed them again. Years passed. Daniel moved out, married, built a life of his own. Ruth remained in the same small house, growing older, quieter, more fragile. She watched Daniel's children run through the same halls he once had and felt a mix of joy and fear she couldn't explain. Every laugh reminded her of the lies she had lived with for decades. Every hug made it harder to justify keeping it. On her 70th birthday, Ruth collapsed in the kitchen. The doctors said her heart was weak, that she needed rest. That time was no longer something she could assume she had plenty of. Daniel sat beside her hospital bed, holding her hand, promising she would be fine. Ruth looked at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with something close to regret. That night, when the hospital room was quiet and the machines hummed softly, Ruth made a decision she had been avoiding for 30 years. If she didn't speak now, she never would. And if the truth came out after she was gone, it would destroy him far more than hearing it from her own mouth. But before she could say a word, Daniel received a phone call in the hallway. When he returned, Ruth's bed was empty. Daniel stood in the hospital hallway, with the phone still pressed to his ear long after the call had ended. The nurse's voice echoed in his mind, calm but urgent, telling him his mother was not in her room and that security was searching the building. At first, he assumed there had been a mistake. Ruth was weak. She could barely walk without support. The idea that she could simply disappear didn't make sense. But when he rushed back into the room and saw the bed stripped clean, the blanket folded neatly on the chair. A cold weight settled in his chest. Hours passed before Ruth was found sitting in the hospital chapel, her hands folded, her eyes closed as if in prayer. She didn't resist when Daniel approached her. She didn't look surprised either. She simply opened her eyes and said his name softly, as though she had been waiting for him. Daniel asked why she had left, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and frustration. Ruth told him she needed quiet before she spoke. She said some truths demanded silence before they could be said out loud. They returned home the next day, the air between them heavy with things left unsaid. Daniel stayed with her longer than he had planned, uneasy and unable to shake the feeling that something was slipping through his fingers. Ruth moved slowly through the house, touching familiar objects as if memorizing them. That night, after Daniel fell asleep on the couch, she pulled the small box from the closet and placed it on the kitchen table. She sat there until morning, her fingers resting on the lid, waiting for courage. Daniel woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of paper shifting. He found Ruth seated at the table, the box open in front of her. She looked older in that moment, not because of her body, but because of the years she had carried alone. She gestured for him to sit. When he did, she pushed a single document toward him. His name was written on it, but not the way he recognized. It was longer, different, official. Ruth told him she had not given birth to him. The words landed quietly, but their impact was deafening. She explained that 30 years earlier, a young woman had come to her door in the middle of the night, desperate and afraid. The woman was barely more than a girl, pregnant and alone, running from a situation that felt impossible. She begged Ruth to keep the baby safe. She said she would return when she could. Ruth agreed without hesitation, believing it would only be temporary. The woman never came back. Ruth searched for her at first, making phone calls, writing letters that went unanswered. Eventually, the trail went cold. She was left with a child who needed a mother and a promise she couldn't fulfill. Ruth chose the only path that felt right to her. She became that mother. She changed names, created a story, and accepted the weight of a lie she believed was kinder than the truth. Daniel struggled to breathe as he listened. Every memory he had began rearranging itself in his mind, moments he had never questioned suddenly glowing with new meaning. He asked why she hadn't told him sooner. Ruth answered honestly. She was afraid he would leave. Afraid he would hate her. Afraid that knowing the truth would erase the life they had built together. She said love had convinced her she was doing the right thing, even when fear was the louder voice. Ruth handed him more papers. Birth records. Old letters. A faded photograph of a young woman holding a newborn, her face blurred with tears and exhaustion. Daniel stared at the picture for a long time, trying to find himself in it. Trying to understand how his entire identity had been shaped by a decision made before he could speak. The most painful revelation came last. Ruth told him the woman who gave birth to him was not dead. She had found out recently, through an old contact, that the woman was alive and living only a few hours away. She had never stopped wondering about him. The reason Ruth disappeared from the hospital that night was simple. She had gone to write a letter she should have written decades ago. Daniel's anger finally surfaced then. He asked how she could decide his life for him without giving him a choice. Ruth didn't argue. She nodded and said he was right. She said she had taken something from him that could never be returned. All she could offer now was the truth, however late it came. The room fell silent as Daniel held the letter in his hands, realizing that the next decision would be his to make. Ruth looked at him with quiet resolve and asked if he wanted to know where the letter was going. Daniel didn't answer her right away. He stared at the envelope resting between them on the table, as if it might bite him if he touched it. The idea that his life extended beyond the woman who raised him felt unreal, like discovering a hidden room in a house he had lived in forever. Ruth waited patiently, her hands folded, her face calm but pale, prepared for whatever response came next. She had lived with this moment in her mind for decades, imagining every possible reaction, and none of them frightened her as much as silence. He finally asked her what the woman was like. Ruth smiled sadly and said she had been brave in ways Daniel might never fully understand. She described a frightened young woman with no support, no safety, and no choices that didn't involve losing something precious. She said the woman loved Daniel deeply, enough to give him away rather than raise him in fear. The love in that decision was something Ruth hoped Daniel would one day recognize, even if it hurt now. Daniel asked why Ruth never tried harder to find her. Ruth admitted she had tried, but not forever. At some point, she stopped searching because finding her would mean explaining everything, and she was afraid that truth would break the fragile peace they had built. She told herself the woman would come back if she could. When she didn't, Ruth took it as a sign that Daniel's life was meant to continue as it was. She had convinced herself that love was enough to make it right. Daniel left the house that afternoon, without saying where he was going. He drove aimlessly for hours, replaying every memory he had of his childhood. The bedtime stories, the scraped knees, the way Ruth stayed up late when he was sick. None of it felt fake. Yet none of it explained the ache growing in his chest, the sense that part of him had been quietly stolen. He realized he wasn't just angry at Ruth. He was grieving a version of himself he never had the chance to know. When he returned home that evening, Ruth was sitting in the living room, the television off, waiting. She didn't ask where he had been. She simply said she would answer any question he had, no matter how painful. Daniel asked if she regretted it. Ruth closed her eyes and said she regretted the lie, but never the love. She said raising him had been the greatest honor of her life, even if it came at the cost of carrying shame in silence. That night, Daniel opened the letter addressed to his birth mother. Ruth had written carefully, apologetically, explaining what she had done and why. She didn't ask for forgiveness.
She didn't demand contact.
She simply told the truth and said Daniel deserved to choose his own future now. Daniel read it twice, then sat for a long time holding the envelope, torn between fear and curiosity. Days passed without a decision. The house felt tense, filled with unspoken questions. Ruth's health worsened, and Daniel found himself afraid of losing her before he had sorted through his emotions. One morning, he told her he wanted to meet the woman. Not to replace her, he said quickly, but to understand himself. Ruth nodded, tears in her eyes, and told him she had already written down the address. The drive to the town was quiet. Daniel's hands trembled on the steering wheel as they pulled into a modest neighborhood. Ruth stayed in the car when they reached the house, saying this was something he needed to do alone. Daniel walked to the door slowly, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure it could be heard inside. When the door opened, a woman stood there, older than he had imagined, her hair streaked with gray, her eyes searching his face with desperate hope. She said his name the way Ruth never had, the way it had been written on the paper all those years ago. In that instant, the truth crashed over him with full force. He wasn't lost. He had been found twice, by two different women, each loving him in the only way they knew how. Behind him, Ruth watched from the car, her hands clenched in her lap, knowing the final part of the truth was no longer hers to control. Daniel stood frozen on the doorstep, unsure whether to step forward or turn back. The woman in front of him looked just as frightened as he felt, her hands trembling slightly as she held the door open. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Years of unanswered questions, of imagined conversations and silent regrets, hovered between them. Finally, she whispered his name again, softer this time, as if afraid that saying it too loudly might make him disappear. Inside the house, everything felt unfamiliar, yet strangely intimate. The walls were lined with photographs of places Daniel didn't recognize, moments from a life that could have included him but hadn't. The woman invited him to sit, offering tea with hands that shook despite her efforts to appear calm. She told him her name and began speaking slowly, carefully, as if each word had to be earned. She explained the fear she had lived with back then, the situation she couldn't escape, the choice that had torn her apart. Giving him to Ruth, she said, was the bravest and most painful thing she had ever done. Daniel listened without interrupting. He didn't feel anger toward her, only a deep, aching sadness for the life they both lost. She told him she had searched for him later, but by then the trail had vanished. She had spent years wondering if he was safe, if he was loved, if he ever thought about her. Hearing that he had been raised with care and devotion seemed to ease something in her, as if a burden she had carried alone had finally been shared. When Daniel returned to the car, Ruth looked up at him with anxious eyes. He didn't speak right away. He simply took her hand, squeezing it gently. That single gesture told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't leaving her. He wasn't replacing her. He was expanding the truth, not erasing the past. Ruth closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks, the relief almost overwhelming. In the weeks that followed, Daniel tried to make sense of his new reality. He stayed in touch with his birth mother, slowly, carefully, allowing a relationship to form without forcing it into a shape it couldn't yet hold. Ruth supported him quietly, never inserting herself, never pulling away. She seemed lighter somehow, as if releasing the secret had given her permission to breathe again. One evening, Daniel sat with Ruth on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. He told her that regardless of biology, she would always be his mother. She had chosen him when she didn't have to, and that choice mattered more than any paper or bloodline. Ruth smiled, a tired but peaceful smile, and said that loving him had never been a mistake, even if hiding the truth had been. Years later, when people spoke about Ruth, they praised her kindness, her strength, her sacrifice. Few ever knew the full story. They simply saw a woman who raised a child that wasn't hers and did it with unwavering love. What shocked everyone, when the truth finally surfaced, wasn't the secret itself. It was the realization that real motherhood isn't defined by birth, but by the courage to choose love and live with its consequences every single day.